Let's get joined up. This week's show is sponsored by Bandcamp.com, an online record store and music community where passionate fans discover, connect with, and directly support the artists they love. There's thousands of bands and artists on there, including my band, the Wry Dogs, whose second album, Pigs Might Fly, is out right now. Here's a quick snippet of the title track, which is also available on Spotify, Amazon, and Apple Music.
Because your eyes may be weeping, but your conscience is sleeping. So baby, don't you cry. Your faces are drying and you say...
It's totally free to join Bandcamp, and as the Wry Dogs are brand new members, we're now looking to grow our fan base, so your support would be greatly appreciated. Just search the Wry Dogs, that's W-R-Y Dogs, and hit the follow button. Right, now we can cue the theme tune.
Joined up writing.
Hello and welcome to the Joined Up Writing podcast, where a little procrastination can go a long way. I'm Wayne Kelly and it's episode 160 with Paul Howarth talking about his latest book, Dust Off the Bones, an historical thriller set in Australia. We chat about writing that difficult second book, getting the work done, and why you need to make the reader turn the page. Paul's a great guest and it's a fascinating conversation. Quick catch up from me first, and you may be able to hear the sound of my hard drive chugging away there in the background. That's because I'm having to slot this intro recording in between actual real life work as I wait for a ton of video footage to download from the server so that I can start an edit. It's a noisy drive, and I'm too lazy to record this in my voiceover booth, so I apologise for that. But I certainly wasn't lazy yesterday when I had my best writing day for some time, managing to clock up 1,900 words, which I know doesn't sound that impressive, but it took a colossal effort to get there. After more encouragement from a writing group, I've decided to set a deadline for this new draft to be completed. So I've given myself until the end of November, and I've put this into Scrivener, telling it I want to write 5 days a week, and it's calculated a daily target of just under 1,000 words for me to hit 80,000, which is round about what the previous version of Safe Hands was. So it's not a huge amount each day, I think that's achievable. I'm not sure how many of you have used the Project Targets window in Scrivener, but it's brilliant. Once you've set your target, you can have the target displayed as a little bar that works its way across with each word that you type. And it even changes colour from red to amber and then green, I think it is, when you hit the target. Yeah, I know, it sounds childish, and maybe it is, but there's still huge satisfaction to be gained from making it change and knowing you've done your bit for the day. But when I sat down to write yesterday, I really wasn't sold on the scene I was about to attempt. I'd got no idea how it was going to go. It took me forever to write the first 500 words. I then sort of crawled up to about 700 words, and even then it was like dragging a huge boulder up the hill to eventually get to 900 words, but then something weird happened. I added one element to the scene. It was literally a random passerby that was watching my characters from the sidelines, and the whole thing just came to life. The next 1,000 words were a breeze, and the only reason I stopped at 1,900 was because I had to go off and do something else. It was an amazing feeling, but it's also kind of sad that I haven't felt it for a while. And so the biggest lesson it taught me, or at least reminded me, because I really should already know it, is that sometimes, most of the time actually, you have to force yourself to write, even if you don't believe in what you're writing or you're convinced you're heading in the wrong direction. When it's painful and slow and ugly, just keep going. It's a job at the end of the day. That's how you kind of have to approach it. Just write anyway, because most issues are psychological, and even when it's a practical problem you might have with a character, scene or story, I find that if I just keep forcing the issue, pushing words onto the page, something will happen. I'm not saying that it should always be this massive chore. Obviously we write because we enjoy it, but sometimes to get to that enjoyment, to get back in the flow, you kind of have to force the issue a little bit. And I just think my subconscious or my characters, something will happen. They'll take control of the situation, and even if things don't resolve in that writing session, even if it was like torture to write, at least you'll have something on the page, something you can work on, refine, rewrite, or even delete. But it always comes back to the same thing. You can't edit a blank page. And I'm saying all of this out loud as much to remind myself that the next time I'm not feeling it, it shouldn't be an excuse to avoid doing the work. I've got a deadline to hit, god damn it. So what about you? How do you get through when you're struggling to hit a word count or get your stuff on the page? Tell me how your projects are going, because I'd love to hear from you. As I heard from people like John Soanes this week, Jim Snell, and everyone else who reached out. I really appreciate it. The best way to get in touch is via email, wayne@waynekellywrites.com, but you can also tweet me at JUPodcast or drop me a line on the FB page. Also, don't forget to join the email mailing list at joinedupwriting.co.uk. It's totally free, and you get a couple of downloadable goodies when you sign up. And you'll be the first to find out about upcoming shows and events. Right, let's get to today's interview with Paul Howarth. So Paul is a British-Australian author and former lawyer who holds an MA in creative writing from the University of East Anglia, where he was awarded the Malcolm Bradbury Scholarship. In 2018, his debut novel, Only Killers and Thieves, was published to international acclaim, and he actually came on the show back then if you want to check it out in the archives, where he won the Barnes & Noble Discover Award for Best Fiction, and his latest book, Dust Off the Bones, is out right now. So enjoy the chat, and I'll pop back at the end for a sign-off.
Joined up writing.
Okay, thanks a million for joining me on Joined Up Writing this morning, Paul. How's things? Why don't you start off by telling us where you are and where you're speaking from, should I say, and how things are going?
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me, Wayne. Pleasure to be on again. I'm calling from sunny, well, not so sunny this morning, Norwich in East Anglia. And yeah, things are going fine, thanks. It's I'm bang in the middle of school holidays. I've got 2 young children, so that's taken up an awful lot of my time. But yeah, as kind of crazy as the world is, I'm kind of doing okay. Thank you.
That's good. That's good. Well, why don't you start off by telling us about your new book, Dust Off the Bones, following up your debut, Only Killers and Thieves?
Sure. So Dust Off the Bones, you can read it as a standalone, but it is also a continuation of that first book, Only Killers and Thieves. But both of these books can be read independently, and they were written to be read in any order. So you could even read the new one first and then go back and read the first one if you wanted to. Mm-hmm. But Dust Off the Bones is essentially, it's a historical thriller. It's set in Queensland, Australia in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, at a time when Australia really wasn't the kind of country that we know today. It was still a collection of self-governing British colonies, largely under the control of the British Crown. And away from the cities, the kind of settled regions in like Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, etc. If you moved inland, what you basically found during most of the 19th century was this sort of alternative Wild West, with gunslingers and dust-blown frontier towns, gold rushes, epic exploration across the outback, trying to tame a land that frankly refused and still refuses to be tamed. Mm-hmm. So that's where we set this story. And it's essentially about 2 brothers who are on the run, both figuratively and literally, from their pasts. As children, they were involved in both a family tragedy involving murder and betrayal, and also became complicit in the massacre of a group of Aboriginal people. These 2 boys, Tommy and Billy McBride, are now estranged. One is in denial about his past. The other one is racked by guilt and regret. But as it says on the dust jacket of the book, even in the outback, the past can't stay buried forever. And when an official inquest is launched into the killings, the boys find themselves on a collision course with each other yet again, and also with Police Inspector Edmund Noon of the Queensland Native Police, mm-hmm. the man who led the attack on the Indigenous group, and now must find both brothers and, in order to save his own skin, silence them both for good.
Brilliant. Well, I haven't read Dust Off the Bones yet, but I loved Only Killers and Thieves, and it's a great collection of characters and a great villain in Noon that you mentioned there. So it's a great premise again. So do you remember kind of what sparked the idea for this, or was it kind of always you'd kind of got the plan for this in your mind when you wrote the first one?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of always thought that at some point I would probably return to the story, because in Only Killers and Thieves, what we basically had was a kind of contained story when these two boys are teenagers, and we see what they went through, we see what it does to them as both individuals and as siblings. And then towards the end of that novel, there's a quick kind of throw forward in an epilogue to when Tommy, the younger brother, is in his kind of early 30s. And we get to see a little bit of the legacy that childhood kind of left him with. But for me, there was always a lot more of this story to come. And whilst, like I say, I kind of thought that I might return to it someday, I wasn't wedded to doing it straight away. But what I found when I kind of sat down to try and write some of the other ideas that I had, some of the other novels that I wanted to look at, that this story kept coming back to me, and it kept kind of like leaping up almost out of my subconscious, kind of tugging at me, saying, "Come on, you have to finish this one first." There wasn't at that stage a kind of grand plan for what exactly was going to happen, other than I wanted to explore, like I say, this legacy of trauma and what it does to two young people who are caught up in events that are both horrific, but that they are also to some degree complicit in. And you had two very different characters in Tommy and Billy. They were brothers, close in age, but very different people. So I kind of set out exploring where would they have gone from where we left them in Only Killers and Thieves. What kind of paths would their lives have taken, and how would they have diverged? And then there was also the bigger issue of not only looking at the question of their own personal accountability, but also the accountability of society and of history, and basically Britain as ruler at that time, and Australia as the kind of country that it grew into. How do those two nations deal with the kind of atrocities that were done during the 19th and early 20th centuries, and how do they kind of move on with their lives? Especially when I read during my research that, I mean, I'm sure we'll get on to talk about the Native Police, maybe the Queensland Native Police, who it's a force that figures prominently in both these books. But they were considered, or are considered by some historians, to have been one of the biggest single killers of Aboriginal people in Australia during the 19th century. And yet, not one single officer, Native Police officer, was ever found criminally culpable for an Aboriginal death. Mm-hmm. So you kind of had these two themes, big themes. You have the kind of personal accountability of the brothers, and then the societal and judicial and political accountability over a police force kind of allowed to run amok, which at the time I was looking at writing this book, and now is incredibly relevant to the world we're living in. The question of kind of unchecked authority. We see it in police forces around the world. We see it in politicians, where there's just no accountability. I mean, how many times do you kind of sit there and maybe hear on the news or watch on the TV some kind of parliamentary inquiry or Senate hearing or whatever it is, where people who you know damn well have done wrong, they just get away with it.
Yeah.
And so, you know, this is the thing about history that just fascinates me, I suppose. You kind of look back through the centuries and you see events and attitudes just repeating themselves.
I was going to say that, you know, there's the whole thing about, why we study history is to learn from the mistakes of the past, but that's just not true. We just constantly repeat them over and over. We've got really, really short memories. We always think we're different. This generation or this era is totally different, but we're just people, and it's the same things over and over again, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So, and all of these things kind of came together, that sort of creative spark to want to continue these stories and sort of explore where these brothers went in their lives, what happened to Australia as a country. I kind of wanted to explore geographically a bit more as well. This book spreads itself, the story, around the country, whereas in Only Killers and Thieves, it was pretty confined to that one isolated area in the outback. But here we have the cities of kind of Brisbane and Melbourne. We have the kind of rolling farmland of Gippsland in Victoria. We have the camel trails in Maree in the dead centre of the country, and the cattle runs that go up and down through the kind of guts of the country. So it was about opening this story up, both thematically, geographically, and kind of narratively, and sort of seeing where I could take it.
Yeah, brilliant. And it's nice. I should imagine it's nice to be able to do that with the characters in particular, because often, unless, even to be honest, even with a series, a lot of, whether it's a crime series or whatever, when you actually take the series as a whole, there aren't that many series that take us over a long period of time, like from somebody being a child to when they're an adult, say, for example. And so you never really get to see the long-term effects of whatever that trauma or whatever that story was that you've told. You never really get to see, you kind of get some kind of sense of satisfaction, and you kind of hope they're going to be okay, and that's that story wrapped up, but you never really see the long-term impacts of it with whatever that is, whether it's violence or whether it's abuse or whether it's just something that's happened in the story or whatever. So that must have been quite nice to be able to do that.
Yeah, and this book, so Dust Off the Bones, spans about, I think it's about 20 years, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So you really were able to kind of to see that development. We meet the characters in this book when they're 19 and 21,
mm-hmm.
and then, like I say, it ends about 20 years later. So we get this kind of arc that it was quite satisfying to write, but I think also hopefully quite satisfying to read, because like you say, you're not just kind of seeing one incident and how that's dealt with, and then you're left to imagine what becomes of them. This actually kind of shows you,
takes you there.
Yeah, and it was quite good to be able to write it as well, fairly economically. So rather than feeling like I had to sort of fill in every year almost, or show the grand sweep of these boys' lives, what I do is I just have 3 sections, and we sort of drop in on them at various points, and each of those sections kind of deals with it's got its own flavour. So like the first section is almost like a western. The second section is more of a courtroom drama, I would say. It's got that kind of inquest at its heart.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third section is like a kind of full-bore revenge thriller.
Mm-hmm.
So you're able to kind of break the book into chunks, which not only serve that character development, but serve the story too.
Brilliant. And so in your mind, did you try to write anything else between, it's not that it's been a huge amount of time, it's only been, I think it's 3 years since only Killers and Thieves came out, but was this always going to be your next book, or did you try to write something else, or did you have other things that were bubbling away?
Yeah, there were a couple of things that I tried to write. I'm trying to think now. I can't really remember. This is kind of the way I work. If I have an idea that I think might be good, then I sort of throw it on the page, and if it doesn't work, then it just gets put away, and I don't really think of it again. But there was definitely at least one attempt at a novel that got a reasonable way in, like 20,000-30,000 words, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then that it just wasn't working. That got canned, and like I was saying, it sort of felt as though
this was begging to be told.
Yeah, this story sort of needed to be finished really before I could move on.
And were the other things kind of in the same genre, in the same location, or do you still find yourself drawn back to that particular?
No, they were totally different, and I am keen to do different things. One thing that I have sort of learned about myself is that the historical stuff does appeal to me.
Mm-hmm.
I quite like doing the research and looking back into places and times and events that, like I was saying earlier, have real resonance and relevance to today's work, today's world. So in the past, I've definitely written contemporary things, unpublished or kind of short stories, that sort of thing. But I am finding the historical stuff more interesting at the moment.
That's kind of where you think you're finding your groove there. Do you think
Maybe.
Do you think that future projects you'll different location, different parts of history, or are you particularly drawn to that particular geography and those times?
Well, I mean, I would never say never. I could come back to it, but yeah, I think it's probably in terms of exploring what I wanted to explore, this sort of confluence in history between Britain and Australia, that time when sort of British direct rule was coming to an end, and the country was having to wrestle its way to some sort of independence, but also deal with the legacy of British rule. I think I've sort of ticked that box with these two books. So yeah, I'll probably move on to something else. I'm sort of planning a new novel at the moment, and that is somewhere totally different time, different place.
Brilliant. Well, how did you? Obviously, you've had kind of 3 years of Only Killers and Thieves being out there. Have you had a chance to get a sense of kind of how it landed with people in Australia and people that are kind of may or may not have been familiar with some of the history, and or may not did, maybe they didn't want to be familiar with some of it, as you say, because some of it's not particularly something to be proud of. But how has it kind of landed there?
I mean, I don't have a huge sense, to be honest, because obviously COVID has happened in between. So I haven't been back. In terms of sort of reviews and that kind of thing, they were fairly balanced. I know that some of the people that I have spoken to, some of the like people in the industry and that sort of thing, have been very positive. I think Australia as a country is becoming more open to looking back and acknowledging and accepting what basically its history entails. These are by far not the only books to have sort of looked back at that time. What they do is bring to light this police force, this Queensland Native Police, which I don't think any other novel, certainly that I'm aware of, go into that force in as much detail. And that has definitely been a surprise to people, that there was this state-sanctioned militia, basically, patrolling the Australian frontier, whose sole purpose essentially was as they called it, dispersal, essentially slaughter of Indigenous Australians who happened to get into white settlers' way. So
it's
they were trying
ethnic cleansing, really.
Basically they were trying to clear the interior for settlement and for cattle grazing. And in order to do that, they needed to move Indigenous people from their traditional lands. And obviously, the settlers found a lot of resistance, so called in the native police, and that's what these guys did.
Yeah, well, as you say, it's such rich seam of stuff to kind of explore, and you've done a great job. And as I say, definitely in the first book, and I'm looking forward to reading Dust Off the Bones as well. So in that, I mean, obviously it's been a weird 3 years, to put it. At least the last 18 months of it have been particularly weird, as they have for all of us. But how did you find the whole experience with that? Your first book out in the world, and how has this 3 years been for you as regards that?
Yeah, well, the publication cycle for the first book, Only Killers and Thieves, was pretty much over by the time COVID hit. So COVID was like sort of January, February was when it really started off, 2020. And by then the book had been out a couple of years. So that didn't impact that first book too much. And luckily, by the time we got into the kind of the meat of lockdowns and school closures and all that kind of thing, I was close enough to the end of writing Dust Off the Bones to be able to know what I had to do in order to get the thing finished. If I'd been right at the start of a project, or in the planning stage or first draft or something, I think it would have been a big struggle. And hats off to writers who've kind of started something and finished it during the last couple of years, because it's been such a weird time and environment to try and create, I've found.
I agree. Yeah.
So I was lucky to be able to finish that first draft in something like, if I remember rightly, like the May time of 2020. And then from there until publication, it's just a case of edits, which are far more sort of functional and far more able to do them during a lockdown or during school closures, etc. Because it's a different side of your brain, isn't it, when you're editing to when you're
organisational almost. It's just like, well, these are the things you have to sort out, so just go and do it, sort of thing. Yeah. I agree. I think with the creativity thing, I've spoken to through the podcast. I've spoken to lots of writers, but also other people, musicians and whatever, and other kinds of writers, and they've all sort of said the same thing. Really, it's been difficult. Not so bad in the last probably 6 months, but particularly the first sort of 6 months of the pandemic was like you did find yourself on the face of, not everybody, obviously, some people were frontline workers and they had to work and all the rest of it. But for some of us, like myself, I mean, I basically ended up at home. I did have a lot of extra time on my hands. Time before, if you'd have told me, oh, you're going to have all this time, I'd have been, oh, that's brilliant. I'm going to get loads of writing done.
Yeah.
But the reality was, a lot of the time was just like staring at the screen and worrying.
Yes.
What's going to happen? Because it's totally different situation. It's, if we have another one, we have more lockdowns and different bits, it might be a bit different because you kind of know what to expect, so you've got an idea of where it goes. But that first time was so bizarre. I mean, all these things were kind of happening for the first time in our lifetimes anyway.
Exactly. And I think when you're creating something from the blank page, or whatever you're doing, music, film, etc., it's your subconscious that does an awful lot of the work, right?
Yeah, and that's right.
And if your subconscious is sort of occupied by the fear of sort of the world ending and pandemics, etc., then it's not doing what it needs to do. It doesn't have that freedom. I think that is a bit of a myth that that all you need is time.
That's right.
In order to create, I think you also need. Well, certainly, I need a sense of sort of balance and peace, and just to let things be in order, I guess, in the outside world, and then you can sit down and just focus on the page in front of you.
Yeah, because I think there's an element of it as well that you sort of thinking, because if you, in the big scheme of things, writing a book or whatever is not that important. A fiction book, I mean, it's a great achievement and everything, but the thing that's in your mind when you're doing it is like, I'm literally just making shit up. It's not that important when there's this other stuff going on. I think that's partly it as well. I think that's kind of nagging away at you all the time. It's like, is this now the best use of the time given what's happening, and will it really matter is the other thing.
And even that question of, if I do get to write this thing, will it be published? Will it be read? Will it be, what? Because when you write a book, it's kind of like a leap of faith. Any book, because you're throwing forward a couple of years or so before the thing actually hits shelves.
Yeah,
and you're hoping that bookstores will still exist. People will still be interested in reading. That society won't be crumbling around us.
Yeah.
And even as those things might sound outlandish to us now, having kind of come to a certain extent out of the other end, like I say, it's all what's going on in your subconscious. And a year ago, 18 months ago, those kind of questions were definitely real. I mean, bookstores, I'm delighted that so many have survived, but a great deal haven't.
No, that's right.
Here we are, kind of trying to throw another book out into the world, and just hoping that someone will be there to read it at the end.
Well, people definitely. I mean, I think that is something that's come out of the pandemic, though. I mean, as if we needed telling, but people do need all this stuff. I mean, they do need books and TV and film and all the other stuff that's, around all these kind of call them distractions or whatever you want to call them, but people do need these things to enrich their life. And I think if anything, people have become, they take it even less for granted than they did before, because especially with you start looking at theatre and stuff like that as well, which has obviously been closed for 18 months pretty much. And so I think people are appreciating this stuff a lot more, really.
Yeah, I was just about to say the same thing, and it's like I remember during the middle of 2020, like new movies and shows on Netflix started to dry up because there wasn't the production going on.
Yeah,
and people are kind of saying, well, why is there no new content? And it's like, well, you just like you say, you do take for granted that writers can write, that producers can produce, and that these things will always be there. And I think it's, well, let's hope anyway that it has changed a bit of people's appreciation for the arts and just what a vital role it can play in society.
I hope so, yeah. So how did you, I mean, pandemic aside, as you said, because you did kind of have a couple of normal years, in inverted commas, with the release of your first book. How did you find that whole thing anyway? Because it was your debut and, it was a whole new experience for you. And how did you find the whole thing?
Oh, I mean, it was great, to be honest. It was exhilarating. It was rewarding. When you've spent so long trying to get a book published, as many debut authors have, to actually see it come out is a thrill. Only Killers and Thieves did very well. It was a book of the year in the Times. It won a big award, probably the biggest award for a debut author in America, which is the Barnes and Noble Discover Award for like a debut or emerging author. So I got to go out to New York and go to the award ceremony there, it was great. And just that, like I say, that thrill of kind of seeing your book on shelves, seeing it reviewed in newspapers, getting to meet readers at festivals. It was fantastic. It's that strange thing. I've heard lots of kind of more established authors talk about this, where you sort of need to wear those two hats. You need to be almost a public persona, and then once that's all finished and it's sort of dried up, then you've got to come back to your desk where it's just you in a room and try and switch back to that person who doesn't think about kind of post-publication stuff. You've just got to focus on the work. So it's if you can do both, then great, because you've almost got the best of both worlds.
But did you, I mean, yeah, it's that whole, I think Stephen King talks about the idea of you write the first draft with the door closed. And I think it's that, as you say, you're kind of locked in and you're kind of thinking it. But did it have a bearing when you started writing Dust Off the Bones, or when you were writing Dust Off the Bones? Did it have any kind of impact on you, in the sense, did you feel more pressure? Did you find yourself overthinking things sometimes, or being a bit precious? Or because that's, the best will in the world, that's quite easy to do, isn't it? To kind of struggle to get out of your own way sometimes with those things.
Do you know what I mean? I would say generally no. Like generally it did. I was able to just write what I wanted to write, but I think there probably were a few kind of moments where a character would do something, or a line would be said, or whatever, and having gone through the publication process, editing, reviews, meeting readers, etc., there maybe is like just that little voice on your shoulder which kind of says, well, should the character do this? Would readers stand for that? Or is the editor going to take this out? Or, well, not take it out, but suggest that you change it.
Yeah.
So so long as that's not too invasive, and so long as you're not making kind of big decisions based on what you think somebody else might expect, then I think that's a good thing, because I think having that bit more experience maybe helps to curb a little bit of the excess. And you can hopefully get things right sooner, rather than churning out a load of stuff that you then have to rewrite. I mean, you've still got to do that anyway, but it maybe helps you avoid making some of the bigger mistakes that you might have done first time round.
Did you find there was a lot of difference, regardless of how, with the book landing and all the rest of it, but did you find that you'd learned a lot from between book one and book two anyway, in terms of your writing or your process, or how you felt about it?
Yeah, you probably kind of come to accept your process a bit more, having gone all the way through. So my process, for example, and like I say, I've just had to kind of come to accept this, is that I will generally get to a point around kind of 20 or 30,000 words in where I know that I will tear it up and start again. And there's basically no way around that. And every time I hit that point, I try and tell myself, no, come on, just keep going, because they always say, right, that you're supposed to just bash out the first draft.
Yeah.
But the reality for me is that if I know something's not working, I kind of liken it to almost building your house on sand. And there's no point for me in carrying on to write another 50,000 words if I know that first 30 doesn't stack up. So I've just kind of accepted that when I hit that point, and it's not like you hit it one day and you're like, okay, there we go, right, I've hit the point. You spend weeks kind of wrestling with this thing and thinking like, well, why can't I make this work? Why have I sort of hit this brick wall? And then it dawns on you, oh right, because now I need to start it again. And
why do you think that is in terms of like this specific? I mean, do you feel like it's because you're writing your way into the story, or is it to do with the characters, or is it because you think you sort of, as you're writing that first 20 or whatever, around 20,000 words, it's that you're kind of deciding within that 20,000 words, even if it's subconsciously, what the story that you want to tell is? Is it more that?
I think it's all of those things. I think it's kind of me working out what the story is, who the characters are, even down to what the prose style and the voice is going to be for the book. I'm not really a great planner. I'm not good at sort of detailed planning when I don't yet know my way into the characters or into the story. So I can sketch out a rough arc and I can know the big beats of a story, and that's fine. But the actual specifics of it, the details, I sort of need to be writing them to work them out. And then I think you kind of get to a point, maybe 20 or 30,000 words in, where you're like, right, now I've got it. Now I kind of understand who these people are, what this story's about, what the themes are. I've finally hit my groove with the voice. So it's then a case of, okay, now I've done that, I'll go back and write the thing properly.
And is that what you do in terms of, do you literally push those 20,000 words aside and start on page 1? Or do you take elements from there and go, okay, well, this bit's okay and this bit's okay?
Yeah, it would be more a case of knowing that the scene is okay and the scene's going to stay, or that chapter or this character, whatever they do, whatever they say, etc. But it wouldn't be a cut and paste job into the new version. It would be still rewriting it, albeit it might end up certain sections might end up quite similar to the first draft. But it would be a kind of rewrite from scratch.
Yeah, that's interesting. So how do you fit your writing around real life? You mentioned you've got a young family and stuff, and I don't know, have you got a job as well, or?
No, so I'm writing full time, trying to.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Yeah, it's I mean, with the kids, it is difficult because my wife works full time as well. So we are certainly at the minute. I mean, we're in school holidays at the moment, as we talk now, and it's almost impossible, to be honest, to try and kind of get any meaningful writing done. So it's quite good in a way that I'm at the beginning of something, because I can just be thinking, planning, doing a bit of reading, researching. And then once the kids are at school, I basically have 9 till 3 every day, where I just sit down in the chair, and those are my kind of office hours, so to speak, or my writing hours. And then once the kids are at home, or I have to take them, to after school clubs and that sort of thing, well, then I can deal with emails and social media and the odd bits and pieces that need to be done. So the core writing hours are when the kids are at school.
And have you got, what's a good writing day for you? Are you a person that kind of measures it on words, or is it more of a sense that you've pushed the book along a certain amount, or how do you kind of measure that?
Yeah, if I've only written, say, 300 words, but I do feel like I've pushed the book along, then I'll feel, well, that's okay. I can handle that. But generally, if everything's just going as normal, then I'd say somewhere in the 1,000 to 1,500 words a day, like good words, that is.
I know what you're saying, because I remember you saying last time you almost edit as you go along, don't you?
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Like if I kind of wish I could just bash something out and then go back and rewrite and edit afterwards, but I find I can't really do that. So if I end up with 1,000 words or 1,500 words or so, then I sort of know that they're for keeps, and they'll stay, and I can move on. I can feel happy about that.
What do you think drives you to write in the first place?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't think anyone's asked me that before. I guess that sense of creating a story. I love telling stories, and for me, it's about almost imagining somebody reading this and just needing to turn the page, to make a reader feel something, empathize with a character, hate a character, be desperate to know what happens in the story, and then maybe once they turn the final page to actually make them think a bit as well, so that they're coming out of the book with questions as well as with enjoyment. So it's sort of all those things. There's a kind of magic to storytelling, I think, whether that's on film or in fiction or whatever it is, where you can transport somebody else to somewhere else and with other people and make them actually feel things almost as viscerally as if it's happening to them in person. And the challenge and the kind of privilege of being able to do that is really special. So it's about trying to tell a story that really affects people, or at the very least makes them desperate to turn the page.
Yeah, that's great. And kind of on that same sort of theme, how have you dealt with reviews along the way? Because I'm sure obviously there's been loads of great praise heaped upon your work, which is brilliant, but we all know how Amazon and everything else works. And
yeah, I mean, it's. I think you kind of learn to almost dismiss them, to be honest. If there's a bad one comes in, the book obviously just wasn't for that person, unless they've given you a 1-star because, I don't know, the package turned up late or something.
No, that's so annoying. I hate those reviews. I know, idiots. I absolutely loved it. It was an absolutely brilliant story, full of thrilling insight. But it turned up and it was slightly dog-eared on the corner because the postman had dropped it in a puddle. 1 star. It's like, oh my god.
Yeah, I even had one guy praise the book like no end, said it was a great book, it was this, that, and the other, and still gave it 1 star. Presumably, he'd like misclicked or something.
God.
But
it's ruined the whole algorithm.
Yeah, exactly. So no, I mean, I've been quite lucky because both books have been generally very, very well received by readers. So on kind of Goodreads and Amazon. I don't think
that's not luck, though, is it, Paul? That's because they're good.
All right, well, thank you for saying that way.
That's good. But as you say, I also, you can go on to Amazon and you can look at absolute masterpieces and still find a load of 1-star reviews just because that's what people are like, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think you kind of learn to accept, I suppose, that once you put a book out there, it's not really yours anymore. People can say what they want about it, and it can be frustrating when you feel like it's unfair. But if that was the majority of them, then I think it probably would affect you. But for me, it's been a very, very small minority, so I can kind of take it with a pinch of salt. Luckily,
that's great. What do you think is kind of the most common mistake that new writers make in your experience? I mean, you were one once.
Yeah. I mean, wow, that's a really good question. I'll think about the kind of technical side in a minute, but in terms of like the most common sort of procedural mistake, almost, I think it's sending your book out before it's ready.
Yeah.
And that would be whether it's to people, early readers, or to agents or whoever. I think it can be really tempting, and I did this. When you get to the end and you think, well, I've worked on this for years. I'm really happy with it. I think it's awesome. It's done, so I'm going to send it out. But it's never done. Certainly not when it's the first draft, or even the second or the third.
Yeah.
And quite often what you need is time between drafts. And when you're an early writer, that's the last thing you want to have to give yourself. You basically want things to happen now because you've finished it and you've done all this work. But what you really have to do is kind of put it away, put it to one side, go and read stuff, really think about, let it germinate in the back of your mind. And things will come to you where you think, actually, this could be better, that could be better. So yeah, definitely that. And then in terms of the actual writing, I would say maybe forcing things, trying to kind of, if you've got like a preconceived idea about what a story is, it can be tempting to almost let the tail wag the dog, and you end up either the story doesn't evolve naturally, the characters don't behave naturally. The biggest thing about a novel, ironically, given that it's made up, is that it has to be believable. So everything that happens, if it jars, then that pulls the reader out of the story, and it makes them kind of stop. And that's the last thing you want. So you want all the characters to be real and to be whole people, even if they've only got one scene. And you need the story to evolve in a way that makes sense, even if it's, set with aliens in outer space. Every story has to have its own internal logic. And I think if you have an idea for a book and you let the idea govern the story, then you're probably going to end up with a problem there. So, off the top of my head,
they're both really, really good, really, really good pieces of advice. What would you say, as you were kind of, when you started out or anything else, what would you say has been the best piece of creative or inspirational advice that you've been given by somebody? I mean, it might even be something that at the time you kind of didn't necessarily take, it might not necessarily be really specific to writing.
I mean, at the time when I was starting out, I can't say I really remember anything in particular. There is something that I read though on Twitter fairly recently that I've kind of adopted as a bit of a mantra, which is by an author called David Joy in America. So I'm not going to claim this as my own, but he basically said, like, the number one rule of writing is to make the reader turn the page.
Yeah.
And I think that's excellent advice. There's all the technical stuff as well that has to come into it, the craft, characters, narrative, voice, etc. But if you're not making the reader turn the page, and that isn't to say that your story has to be action packed or thrillerish or anything like that. It could simply be that kind of emotional tug to find out what happens to a character.
Those questions, raising the hooks and those questions.
Why? But ultimately, if you're not making a reader turn a page, then you're going to end up losing them, basically. So I think that's good advice.
That is great advice, and that's kind of a good place to kind of wrap things up. But before we do, Can you give us a sense? I know it sounds like you're very early on in the next project, but can you give us a sense of what might be next, and also tell people where they can find out more about you and your work?
Yeah. So the next project, this is the danger with me, because I can tell you about it, but then in 20 or 30,000 words.
I was going to say, you best not.
Might be in the bin.
Yeah, don't jinx it. I don't want you to jinx it. So you don't have to be very specific, because I know I've got some writers that have got, and I sort of know where they're coming from. They go, no, if I start telling you about my story now, it will fall apart in front of my eyes.
Yeah. Well, look, all I'll say is that at the minute, the thing that I am planning is it's got a historical feel to it. It will be that same kind of page-turning, thrillerish book with bigger issues and bigger themes, and that's about all I can say. But yeah, and that if it's the one I'm planning, then it won't be Australian, so it'll be set somewhere else.
Brilliant.
And to find out more about me, you can go to my website, which is paulhowarthauthor.com. You can find me on Twitter, which is paulhowarth _. Dust Off the Bones is out on 26th of August and available in all bookstores and online. And Only Killers and Thieves is still available in paperback.
Yeah.
So check them out.
Definitely check them out. They're brilliant. Well, it's been great to talk to you again, Paul. But for now, thanks for coming on Joined Up Writing.
Thanks so much for having me.
Joined Up Writing.
There you go. Thanks again to Paul, and I'll put all of his links in the show notes over at joinedupwriting.co.uk, or you can find them in the podcast description on whatever device you're listening to this on. That pretty much wraps it up for this week, but don't forget to get in touch with all your thoughts on the show, your feedback, and to tell me what's going on with your writing, and you can do that by dropping me an email at wayne@waynekellywrites.com. Also, remember you can find the entire back catalogue of interviews on the website. Make sure you subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Overcast, YouTube, or wherever else you get your podcasts from, and then you can have the podcast downloaded automatically every single week. Also, remember to leave us a nice rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you listen to the show. And please, please, please recommend it to one of your friends or several of your friends. So that's it for this week. Thanks for listening. I'm Wayne Kelly. Happy writing, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.